Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome to Is It Crazy or Is It God? IICIG, IICIIG. What's going on? We're back once again after reading Leviticus
Oh, Leviticus.
14 through 23. It's very interesting because Leviticus is kind of not a difficult read, but it's a lot of instructions, very specific, and it's a lot of old ways of doing things, old rituals, old laws. So it's very interesting to see this from this perspective of God. But before we get into that, how was your week?
I always answer first.
Oh, I can go.
I'm gonna flip it on you. How was your week?
Listen, guys, I love to talk. So, actually, my week was great. It's always good when you wake up and, you know, I've been having this moment of clarity where I need to fix some things in my life, and it's not a hard fix. It's not an easy fix. It's aligning my habits and being consistent, right? So when I say it's not hard, people think it's hard, and some things are difficult, not hard, right? Because you just have to shift your mind. And when I say not too easy, it's the same. It's just balance, right? Because you don't want to be like, man, this is extreme. Nothing is too extreme. It's two sides, right? Shout out to Myron. Two sides of a slice of bread. So this week, I'm going to focus on discipline. That's the key word I've been telling myself.
Yeah.
Discipline. Like, I have my schedule, and discipline and boundaries. Those are my two things I'm gonna work on this week.
That's good.
This week. So boundaries for everything, because in my schedule it's time that I have for God, me, you, this fourth quarter. Yes, I'm a unicorn, D-City Life, and you also want to support, right? You got to support your spouse. So my time and her time intermingle sometimes. So that's why sometimes you got to set boundaries with outside sources than that.
Yeah.
So, and then I want to be disciplined in waking up early, working out, and following my schedule, because discipline leads to a lot of other things in life. Because once you become disciplined, you look up and you're like, oh, I've been disciplined in this habit. And once you become disciplined in a habit, that leads to consistency. So like discipline and consistency almost, they're connected, really similar, but discipline is what you need. Discipline in order to have consistency, because in the words of my beautiful wife, she always says I steal from her, and I do, but she says that you have discipline, but it's not the habit that you want to be doing. You have discipline on going on social media.
Well, I say you consistent.
Oh, you're consistent.
And not just you,
right.
but us. Everyone.
Everyone. I'm not saying.
Yeah.
Like me, like I'm disciplined and consistent in scrolling on Instagram instead of posting. So,
well, go ahead.
Yeah, so that's all I'm saying. It's just, I think that discipline is very tied into developing a new habit and consistency. Because if you're disciplined to the habit, you're going to be uncomfortable. But then, once you're disciplined in that uncomfortable habit, once you're disciplined in uncomfortability, it becomes a habit. You get better at it, and then it becomes consistent because you're disciplined in the habit. If that makes sense. It might not, guys.
It makes sense to me.
So that's why.
Yeah.
Discipline.
So, but your week was good.
It was good, man. A lot of clarity. So next week, I'm gonna let y'all know how this discipline and setting boundaries went.
Yeah. So it's funny. You probably don't even notice this anymore because it's there. It's been there for probably a couple of years. But I have these post-its on the side of the bed.
Oh yeah.
And I think one of them is consistency. One of them is definitely discipline.
Mm-hmm.
I like to do this thing where I look at words and I really look up the meanings, because sometimes we use words, right, in our society, even like love, and sometimes we use compound words and we don't recognize the breakdown of them. Like I always say this thing about the word believe, but I'm not going to go into that right now. Discipline is one of those words that I have on the side of the bed, and the definition that I resonate with is to bring order to. Discipline is also a specific practice, right? So a discipline, right? A discipline of medicine or a discipline of law, right? So it's a practice. So which is funny because that's kind of one of the words that you talk about sometimes is practice. But yeah, it's interesting that you bring up boundaries and discipline in the same sentence, because I feel that same way about myself, and I feel like for me, I'm kind of not wanting to take your answer, but I'm looking at discipline in a way where it's setting a boundary with myself, right? So it's like the same way that I would set out a boundary for someone else, right, to have an order to my schedule or an order to my resources that I'm allowing them access to, right? I need to set that up internally. And so I'll say that my week went well, considering that there's so many things that I need to develop discipline with, right? So, and not even develop, but just etch up a notch, a few notches, right? Yeah. Right? Just and so it's funny that this chapter, this part of the chapter we're reading, really the whole chapter so far, is about kind of God setting a discipline and boundaries for the people. I didn't even make the connection until we just started talking about it, because one of the things that makes this chapter so powerful is that God is setting out these boundaries for the people, these guidelines to say, this is how to do this. This is how to live this way. I want you to live this way. And we'll probably get into it a little bit later, but I think I know why. We don't know why God does what it says what he does, but it's funny to me, or it's interesting to me that I'm making that connection, because there's certain things that I noticed while we were reading about myself, and about how it makes you ask, am I following these rules? Not necessarily these rules, but am I following the known rules that I need to be following? So yeah, my week went good, considering I guess it did go well, because here's why. I'm noticing things about myself that I can improve on, and that I have like the agency to improve on, and I'm excited to do that. But it is kind of like a sobering moment, right, to think about how many things you want to improve in. So it was good, because I have the ability to put those things in place for myself. But it's also challenging, because it makes you have to look at yourself, right? It makes you have to take a hard look at yourself. And so I did that this week. That is the challenging part. Yes, that's the difficult. Because it's so easy to not to. That's like, just don't think about that right now, right? But I'm at the stage where I'm just like, no, think about that. Like, what are you actually doing? What are you doing, right? Anyway, that's a whole nother show.
Nother show, because you could dive into, can go deep with that.
Go real deep with that. But my week was good. I learned a lot about the word, and we're just gonna probably jump right in, because that's like the perfect cue into to what we read.
There it is. Okay, so Leviticus 14.
Oh, did we say we read? We read Leviticus 14 through 23. You probably already said that. Mm-hmm. Okay, sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. So 14 and 15 talk about more cleansing from the skin. Mm-hmm. Remember, this is about leprous disease, which is prominent back there or back then, or skin disease. Mm-hmm. Bodily discharge and cleanings. Mm-hmm. So what I had to learn is it was a lot of times when we're reading Leviticus is saying unclean. Unclean is not sinning. It's distinct.
It's different.
It's different.
Being unclean and sinning is two different
things.
Yeah.
Sinning is sinning. Being unclean is a lot of times washing up, making sure, if you have a disease or even if you don't, like bodily discharge is a bodily discharge.
Right, and it's natural, but it makes you unclean.
It makes you unclean, which means you just have to wash yourself. What I did notice is they were washing themselves up. It talks about women's menstruation and how it's like 7 days. But it says, I think they're at 7 days and you have to wait. You have to be unclean for 7 days and wait till the evening. But most times, if I'm not mistaken, menstrual periods last around that time anyway.
Yeah, right? Anywhere from like 3 to 7 days.
3 to 7 days, right? So
that's what they teach us in school.
Yeah.
I mean,
it's different.
Everybody knows what their own is.
Yeah, it varies. But it's just interesting that back then it's just these guidelines. Okay, so your question is, pick some rules and state how you feel they prevented the spread of disease or germs.
All right, I'll pick 2 because I don't want to take all the answers.
Yeah.
I'm probably going to take yours anyway, so whatever. I noticed how many times they mentioned washing up, right? Like, and washing, and they even mentioned one time in here, at least one time, washing your hands. So like if you were to touch an animal, or if you were to really even just to come into the tabernacle, they had to wash and they had to do a ceremonious cleansing of themselves. Like they talked about Aaron putting on the linen and being in the tabernacle and doing the offerings for people, and he had to wash before he came into the tabernacle because it was a sacred place. And several times in here they talked about if you do this, then you're thought of as unclean, and you have to wash yourself, wash your clothes, even when they were making sacrifices, right? Because you think that it's probably bloody, because they had to do the drops of blood, they had to sprinkle some of the blood on the side. So it's like, if you have all this blood everywhere, you have to wash yourself afterwards. And they made several references to that and washing hands. And it reminded me of what we just went through with, we're still going through with this COVID-19, because I remember in the beginning how they were saying before anybody talked about a vaccine or anything like that, the only protection we had was to cover our mouths, and I think at one point we were all wearing gloves and stuff too, but to cover our mouths, wash your hands. They kept saying wash your hands, and use hand sanitizer when you don't have a sink available to wash your hands. And I remember just thinking to myself, well, we're doing that anyway. I did not realize how many people were not already just washing their hands. And so we come from the food industry, right? We have a background in hospitality. So it was a part of my, to be honest with you, that's how we grew up. I just remember that was probably one of the things that I heard my mother say more than 100 times, right? Like all the time. Wash your hands. Don't touch that. Wash your hands. You come from outside, wash your hands.
Don't open the refrigerator. Wash your hands.
Oh my gosh, like over and over. And even more so than because I said so, or things like that, or I'm your mother. I just that was just something that we were just trained to do. So it was odd to me when I kept hearing this on the news and when the coronavirus hit, that this is a thing, like, and people were saying, like, that I know, that I worked with, that or knew otherwise, like, oh, well, I guess I gotta wash my hands now, or I gotta wash my hands more often. And I was washing my hands more often, but still wasn't very much more than I would normally do it, right? Because that's just what I was taught. So I thought that was interesting, that that was kind of a connection of the Old Testament and what their rules were, and how it kind of comes into today, because God put those rules there, not even just to be, I mean, he wants us to be clean, but I think there was a level of protection there, because that's how the spread of disease was mitigated, right? And as we see present day, that's how the spread of disease is prevented, right? Through washing your hands, making sure that you are cleaning your clothes and cleaning your hands.
It did state that. And then you had to quarantine. Also, one of the things, you mentioned this, that it was mold. So if mold's in your house, you have to clean it. And they say remove it. And if it comes back, they knock the whole house down. So it's just very interesting. And then, of course, you had to do an offering when you were unclean. Most of it was with birds, I believe. Not with birds. Let me be very specific.
Turtle doves, pigeons.
Turtle doves, and pigeons. So that's especially if you were unclean. So it was just very interesting to me how they defined unclean and sin. I was like, oh man, you're sinning. It's like, well, no, you might have a discharge then, and listen, just not worry about it. Just clean yourself up, wash your clothes, wash your hands, wash your body, and don't come out till the next day.
Right.
That's what it sounds
after dark. And that was also an interesting thing. Sorry, let me touch on that too, because it kept saying how wait until the evening, right? Until after the sun goes down. And I thought to myself, what could be the significance of that? I know earlier on when we started learning about the virus I was talking about, they said there was something about how sunlight sort of kills germs, or sunlight rejuvenates and that, it doesn't clean, but it being in the UV rays and all that stuff in the sunlight, it has this natural component of just, I don't know, knocking out the virus. I guess it's harder to catch it if you're in the sunlight. I don't know.
Probably anyway. A lot of vitamin D.
So it's funny because they kept saying if you're thought to be unclean, you clean yourself, and then at dusk or at sunlight, after the sun goes down, then you'll be considered clean again.
So
be unclean until evening.
Leviticus 16 through 18. The rules, the Day of Atonement, rules about animal blood, and rules about sexual relations. So, the Day of Atonement, I'm going to read what it is. Okay, right? It's a ritual occasioned by the death of Nadab and Abihu. Those were the sons of Aaron. And the prescription sets out how and for what purpose Aaron, the chief priest, is to enter the most holy place. And the account ends with the institutionalization of the ritual. The nature of the ritual shows the purification of sins and uncleanness must be done at the innermost part of the tabernacle, and all the other purification rituals hinge on the ceremony of this day. So basically, the Day of Atonement it's for everybody. Everyone. All the sins, all the uncleanliness, boom. Aaron goes to the tabernacle, and it's not just, it's for everybody. They talk about the laws against eating blood. And it talks about eating blood is kind of like ritualistics, and I believe it has to do with idols. So if you're drinking animal blood, and listen, guys, listen. We're not talking about a medium rare steak, okay? We're talking about sacrificing animals and drinking their blood. And I think I watch a lot of crazy movies, and every time that I see somebody doing that, it's not good. It has to do with witchcraft or voodoo or vampires, or zombies or something where it's like eating. It's not good, right? So that's the laws against that. It's just, if you walk into somebody's house and they just have a jar of animal blood,
okay,
I would suggest you're friends with them.
Oh my gosh.
And then you have unlawful sexual relations. So it just talks about not having sex with incest. Like you can't have sex with your aunt or your uncle or your
siblings or anything.
Your siblings, your brother's wife or your sister's husband, stuff like that. That's the rules about sexual relations. So here's the question. Pick some of the rules and state how you feel they prevented people from hurting each other.
Okay. Well, I'll start with the one that I'll go back to that you said about the blood. In my Bible, this is the Everyday Life Bible, the Amplified version from Joyce Meyer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some of this is her commentary, but it's just like a study Bible. But she was just saying, or what this says, it's a life point. Mm-hmm. The chemical substance that we call blood carries life. If a person loses his blood, he loses his life. No blood means no life, because the blood carries the life. Right? Life is a spiritual substance, but it must have a physical carrier.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was one of the rules, and journey with me here. I think it was one of the rules that prevented people from hurting themselves, because as we know now, that you could get disease through blood, right? If somebody, like they were talking about leprosy, if you're sick and somebody encounters, your blood, they might, especially if they drink it, right? And I'm not saying that they were drinking people's blood, but I'm just saying the same with an animal. If an animal had a sickness, I'm thinking it's possible that you could get sick from a sick animal's blood. So, and then we still have a lot to learn and a lot to read, but just the idea that blood is life, right? I think that it kind of sets the precedent of like not wanting to have someone bleed. So I'm stretching it a little bit here. It's a little bit of a stretch, but it's like people, I'm sure back then would fight. They talked about some people killing each other and stuff like that. So, but I think bloodshed was kind of like, okay, you want to get away from that. So, okay, that was like,
no, I agree with you. I think a fight. Right? So a fight is like, okay, whatever, you go to court. But if you kill somebody, then it's like you have to, because like you just said, blood is life.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it even goes into say, I don't know if this chapter, but it says that people can't sacrifice if you're not informed to. If it's not an offering, then you're not sacrificing an animal. Because why are you sacrificing it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. You shouldn't do it. You shouldn't do it for no reason.
We're not talking about eating, guys.
Right?
We're not talking about, I have a goat.
Just sacrificing, just killing it. Yeah.
Right. You know what I'm saying? I have a goat. I want to eat this with my family. That's not what he's talking about. He's talking about sacrificing.
Mm-hmm.
There's no reason for you to kill an animal if it's not sacrificing to the Lord atonement for your sins, which is, and I think they explain it, life for life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why. So we're not supposed to be drinking animal blood.
Yeah. So I think
Yeah.
that just kind of put a bad rep on just even how you deal with blood, which probably eventually help people. Now, most of the information that I saw about protecting one another as far as the rules were in Leviticus 19.
Yeah.
So it's, I guess 19:14 they kind of talk about like you shall not curse a deaf man, put a stumbling block before the blind, you shouldn't do injustice, you shouldn't go around gossiping amongst your people, you shouldn't hate your brother, taking revenge. So I think those were a lot of the rules that I saw that would protect people from each other.
Yeah.
And they said something about neighbors.
Right. So I think this two things, right? With the animal blood, not sacrificing, not drinking it, because that's a ritual that 9 times out of 10, if you're not at the tabernacle, then you are idolizing another god by sacrificing an animal. 2, the sexual relations. I think it protects people in the way of not only incest, but you don't want. I don't want to say this.
STDs?
I know, like emotionally.
Oh, right.
This is my husband. This is my wife.
Yeah, they did mention that.
Like what
about like not taking your sibling's wife or something, right? Yeah, not being, and they even touched on not taking a wife and her sister, which we know that's what happened with Leah, right?
Yeah.
So that is, that's true.
So
that prevented people from
it's
hurting
an emotional connection.
Yeah.
If look what happened between Leah and Isaac, where the connection wasn't really love. He didn't love her as much as he loved Rachel.
Yeah.
You know, so it's an emotional. It hurt Leah. It did. And it's an emotional. She had to bargain for time with him. That's crazy. But we discussed that. But that. And see, the great thing about reading the Bible is you start remembering stories that it happened to, because it's applicable to this day. Yeah. So, but that put a wedge between them. Yeah. So I think emotionally, that kind of protects people as well.
That's a great point.
So now, Leviticus 19-21. Faith just mentioned some of these, right? Do you have?
Sorry.
It's all good. Miscellaneous laws, punishment for severe sins, and marriage rules for priests. Man, okay. So the punishment for severe sins, I believe it was 2. You're dead, or you're removed from your people.
Yeah.
Which is worse? Which is worse? Let me ask that question.
Death, I would think, because at least if you don't die, you can go on and find another people. I would think, but back then there was probably so many. I mean, there wasn't a civilization where you could be like protected. Exactly. So I don't really know how that worked. I would think death, because especially if you died because of your like sin, like where do you think you're going? You know what I'm saying? Pre-Jesus. I just don't think that would be good. I just feel like that's the worst thing. You'd be put to death. Even in here, they had adulterers would be put to death. Yeah. And I was like, whoa.
Somebody, and I don't know what sin this is, but some by fire, some by stone. Yeah. So I get that. But I'm gonna listen, death is quick sometimes. But sometimes when you're removed from your people, you have to live with that every day. Yeah. And this isn't like, oh, you got kicked out of D.C. so you can go to Upper Marlboro. Yeah. It's like, I'm in the wilderness by myself.
Yeah. Oh, God.
There's no God. He shunned me. My people have shunned me. I don't think that sucks. You know, you're kind of alone. Yeah. Especially if you grew up, right? Think if you grew up as a child and then you do something heinous, like, I'm just making this up. You sleep with your cousin or something, right? You didn't know it was your cousin, but you're married like if you're a guy that grew up and you know about all you know is God. You hear stories and you slip up. You're married. Sex with your cousin. You didn't know it was your cousin, but you're an adulterer. And they say, all right, now you're kicked out. All that you know is gone. So sometimes it kind of sucks. And then God saying He'll shun you, like what? Now think about it. If you don't have a connection with God, then I believe that's more painful than death. But you're right, because death is not also having a connection with God. So yeah, it could be. I'm just saying, getting shunned, it's not cool, And it went into the marriage of priest, which, I mean, you got to be tight. You can only marry virgins.
Right? The life of the priest. And I mean, that still carries over to today, because we put so much pressure on our like pastors and people, like, even I'm sorry, I gotta bring this up. When that whole thing happened with Kirk Franklin, when he cursed at his son, I just personally felt like that it was extreme the way people were treating him, as if it's so horrible to say curse words, especially because we've seen him before interact with other people who weren't his family and treat them with love. And there was that one clip of the man that was telling him that he was wrong, and he sat there and listened to him. And then it comes to disciplining your own son, who you have obviously history with and know what that relationship is, and you're trying to discipline him or show him some authority I don't know the relationship, but what I'm saying is that was his son. That is his son. And I felt like when everybody came out against him for that, it was just, I thought it was extreme, because even if that's not like what you expected from him, we put people on these pedestals where they can't even be human. So it does say in here that the priests had to have specific, like they basically had to be the cleanest of the clean. Which makes sense as far as they were doing the sacrificing. They were the examiners of people. They were the examiners of home. When you talked about before, when people were having like mold and stuff in their home, they were doing a lot of the things. So they were considered the cleanest, and that makes sense. But at the same time, they are human. And so I was just thinking about that, because it's like we kind of forget sometimes that these are still humans. And even Aaron in the Bible, his sons died because they made a big mistake. And I mean, people make mistakes. So I mean,
but here's to your point. That was with God, not.
Oh, absolutely.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah,
like, not the people. But see, that comes from judgment.
Yeah, for sure.
That is between Kirk Franklin and his son and God.
Yeah. That's exactly what I was making.
That's exactly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hitting my point, because that's exactly what you're saying. What happened to Aaron's sons is
that was between them and God.
That was between him and God.
Yeah, for sure.
You know what I'm saying? And nobody. And it seems back here, there's so many rules. You trying to survive. Like, there's a cloud. There's God. Did I do anything?
Right. And so let me just say this.
This is real.
Reading this, it was not even just like difficult to read. Sometimes I think it's on purpose, and it's good because repetition helps you learn. Sometimes you'll read something and it'll say the same thing, but then other times it'll say something slightly different, and it has the same setup, the same wording before. There were a couple times when we were reading, because we'll read out loud to each other, that I would think, did I go back a page?
Yeah,
no,
man.
I already read this, right? And then it'll be like, no, this is a different part. It's just kind of saying something similar, right? Now we're talking about a different animal that they're sacrificing, and we're talking about a different ritual, right? Yeah. So, but one of the things that I noticed is that there were a lot of instructions, specific instructions and rules. And I was thinking to myself, how could you remember all of these, right? I'm sure they probably had it written, but that was one of the things that kind of, when I mentioned, oh, this is sobering, because it made me think, how many things am I doing wrong, because I don't even remember all the things that I'm not supposed to do. But I think that's going to be it's obviously for a reason. And as we come to see, a lot of these were meant to protect them from spreading disease, from hurting one another, from getting sick, from these kinds of things. And I think moving forward, we're going to see when we read forward that they're getting ready to go into another land. And if they can here we go. Just saw it. If they can just keep these disciplines, right? Then when in their boundaries, when they encounter this new land or this land that they're going to, because they've been in the wilderness for some time now. And so God's teaching them the rules, teaching them how to live. They listen to him, and he gave them specific instructions on the tabernacle. Now he's putting these rules in place. If you can just get yourself disciplined to these rules, then you'll be okay, because then you'll be living this way already. Not even just for your protection, but just to be obedient. So then we're going to see how that plays out. But now it's starting to click to me, actually, because it's like, it's not about necessarily remembering all the rules and, oh, you forgot a letter or you forgot a word, or, you know what I mean? But it's about creating a discipline so that you kind of get in sync with what's right from what's wrong. And a lot of the stuff, like I said, is repetitive. So a lot of these things are very similar. So you know that if you're not doing one of these things, then you wouldn't think about doing something like it. So now it's starting to click to me now.
Also, ready? You're exactly right. And I believe he's protecting them from the world. You're about to go into this world that you have no idea what's going on. And just like how we read the Bible to be obedient to God, we need to read the Bible to develop these discipline and boundaries, because God's protecting us from the world.
Oh, that's a great point. I'm so glad you said it like that, because sometimes you can, oh man, that's so amazing. Sometimes when you're reading this, and we had a discussion, like a sidebar discussion as we were reading, because we were like, are these the rules of now? Are we supposed to be doing this? Like, I know he's telling this to the Israelites, but are we supposed to? That's where the medium rare steak thing came out, because it's like, oh, well, God is saying in this chapter that you're not supposed to eat blood, and I've had a medium rare steak before.
Not supposed to eat pork.
You know what I mean? And I was just thinking, wow, is this something that I've been doing wrong this whole time? And then we were trying to have this conversation around, well, are these the rules that he gave the Israelites that are now morphed into something else? Because we're not Israelites and we weren't living during this time, and now since Jesus has died for our sins, how does that change things? We're going to have to read along and see. But it doesn't change things. But as you mention it now, it's interesting, because some of the things that were the rules in here are still rules that we live by, like the washing of the hands, like some of the things that would make you feel unclean, like that still feels like a natural thing. Like, yeah, if you had a disease or if you have boils on your skin, you would kind of feel unclean. So, and then other things too. So it's like making that connection was big there, James, because I'm thinking about it now. When you're reading the Bible and you kind of are feeling like a little small, like, I don't know if I could ever actually do this, right? It's not necessarily about that. It's about a discipline to live by, to be obedient. And as close as you can get to obedient, you're never going to be 100% out of the park perfect.
Nope.
But if you can follow this discipline and you can follow these laws, then you're less likely to be tempted or to be doing in the wrong place at the wrong time type of thing, right? So that's a really good point. That's great. You're the best. I'm sorry. Sorry, what was the question even? Pick some laws and describe how God was protecting the heartbroken and abused. Oh, because I had already said that.
Mm-hmm.
It was the blind. Don't put a stumbling block before the blind.
Mm-hmm.
There is some information in here about if a man has an intimate relationship. This is Leviticus 19:20. If a man has an intimate relationship with a woman who's a slave acquired for marriage to another man, there should be punishment for him if he, doesn't do it the right way. And then I think there's a lot to go along with that same sentiment, because there's a lot of things that you shouldn't hate your brother in your heart. It talks about how you should treat your neighbor. So I already kind of went over that stuff, but he's protecting the people with that law or with that rule. So
yeah. And here's some other things, right? It says don't any cuts on your body, no tattoos. Here's one we were talking about. Don't interpret omens or tell fortunes. Which I think in your interpretation.
Yes, so the Joyce Meyer Amplified version, there's a lot broken down here. So yeah, they talked about necromancy or whatever it's called.
Necromancy.
I don't know how to say it, guys.
I only know it from a movie I like, and it's I like to watch all these movies, and the beings in there were called necromancers. Necromanders.
I hope I'm saying it right.
And the necromanders, they were worshiping spirits, and this is before I even read this in the Bible. And they weren't worshiping one God. They were all worshiping like the afterlife and these spirits. So it's very interesting that, and it's a sci-fi movie, right? And it's just very interesting that it's something in here that you're not supposed to be doing. Like
I'm going to point to the actual verse.
Mm-hmm.
It's Leviticus 31.
Mm-hmm.
Do not turn to mediums, and in my version it's amplified, so I'm going to read the whole thing. Mm-hmm. Do not turn to mediums who pretend to consult the dead, or to spiritists who have spirits of divination. I think I said that right. Mm-hmm. Do not seek them out to be defiled by them. I am the Lord your God. Now, with that, there is a little excerpt here in the Joyce Meyer Amplified version where it mentions, I'll just read it. Many people, including some who consider themselves Christians, participate in practices that God considers vile and evil. They innocently think that there's nothing wrong with such things as reading horoscopes, consulting psychics. They wonder why they do not have peace. Then they wonder why they do not have peace. She says, the Bible says in the latter days, many false prophets will rise up and tell people what their itching ears want to hear. People will search for one teacher after another who will tell them something pleasing and gratifying to suit their own desires. They will turn away from hearing the truth and wander off into listening to myths and man-made fictions. I'm going to continue on here because this is where it gets really interesting. Mm-hmm. Never before have we seen such an influx of psychics vying for a ready ear. Television programs feature mediums who claim to be connecting with departed loved ones, but the tragic truth is that psychics such as these are taking advantage of grieving people. These mediums are really communicating with familiar spirits who tell half-truths about the past and lies about the future. God's word clearly says to turn away from mediums and spiritists because they will deceive and defile us. This is a serious command. And then she goes on to name out fortune tellers, psychics, horoscopes, witchcraft are forbidden in God's word. And we are to be led and guided by the Holy Spirit. We do not need a phony substitute when the real thing is available. Mm-hmm. I'm going to go ahead and be honest here. I've watched some of those shows. Mm-hmm. I've watched them several times. It's funny. It's not funny, but it's interesting because here's our conversation that we had. Those things are interesting. A lot of the times you'll hear something, and she mentioned half truths, which really kind of perked my ears up because I was like, sometimes you could hear somebody speak like that, a psychic or a tarot card reader or something, and you do it for fun. You're reading your horoscope for fun, and there's some truth to it, and you're like, oh wow, this person really knows what they're talking about. And I never had it put to me quite this way, where it's like, well, yeah, they have some half truths, like they're in another realm, right? So there might be some things that they could touch on that are real, that are true, but don't be romanced by the thought that, oh, this source knows everything. I'm gonna rely on this source of information, because why would I do that when some things you probably just really not supposed to know anyway?
Oh,
right. Like if you knew how hard it was to get to where you are today, would you have taken the same steps? Right? If you knew, I always bring this lady up because I love her. If Harriet Tubman, well, she did it 19 times, but I was gonna say, if Harriet Tubman knew how hard it was, or if you knew how hard it was to walk from Maryland to Pennsylvania, would you do it after, you know what I'm saying? Or would you just say, oh, nah, I ain't about to do all that? You know what I'm saying? That's what I'm saying. If you're seeking information because you're just curious, could that knowledge actually prevent you from doing what you were meant to do?
Yeah, because what we're learning, right? The unknown is uncomfortability.
Yeah.
If you know, where do you lie?
Yeah.
You know that you're supposed to be. It's a difference between visualizing and manifesting and going to seek it out from somebody who's telling you.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
It's a difference between visualizing where God's like, you can do this, you just need to do this.
Mm-hmm.
Than somebody saying, oh, this is all your whole path, and then it's a half truth.
Right.
So you don't even know where you're going and give you a half map. Well, if you just be uncomfortable and give it the unknown,
yeah,
then you'll be exactly where you need to be.
Yeah, you just got to be okay with not knowing everything.
Not knowing. You draw your own map. And that's the definition of greatness. That's the definition of being successful, is being disciplined and obedient to God and drawing your own map that He has for you. He has a map for you. You just have to be disciplined enough to do it.
Yeah.
And set some boundaries on the way.
Yeah.
And then next thing you know, you're like, man. Then you draw maps for other people, but that's neither here nor there. That's a whole combo, guys. So, but yeah, that's cool. Oh, and I'm gonna touch on this before we go to the next one. We talked about this, and I want to just express it. Leviticus 19:23. When you come into the land and plant any kind of tree or food, then you shall regard its fruit as forbidden. 3 years it shall be forbidden to you. It must not be eaten. And the 4th year all of its fruits shall be holy, an offering of praise to the Lord. But in the 5th year you may eat its fruit, to increase the yield for you. I am the Lord your God. So we talked about that. And here's the interesting thing about that. Is number one, that's building discipline and setting boundaries.
Yep, you gotta wait the 3 years to eat the fruit.
You gotta wait. And if I've never grown a fruit plant, or I do have an aloe plant.
I have grown, so I know this. Yeah, go ahead.
Right. So I haven't. I will though.
Mm-hmm.
I will. I've already started my green thumb. It's working. It's not green yet, but I'm learning. But I'm assuming that 3 years is a good enough time for a fruit or a garden to mature.
Oh, absolutely.
You know?
Yeah.
And then you give it to the Lord. And then the 4th year you give it to the Lord, and the 5th year you have an abundance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right? Then you just have an abundance. And then they talked about how you leave the some of it on the ground for the less fortunate, right? And for strangers to eat from, and you just pull from the tree. And
then not only is people that are less fortunate, right? It's not like, oh, what are you doing in my yard? It's like, oh, you can have this, and you're giving back to the earth.
Yeah.
It's
It's a cycle.
It's
And
a
so let me touch
cycle.
on that a little bit, because this is when we talked about that, this was my thinking. Because I have grown tomatoes before, and it's super fun. And here's what happens. Let me just tell you about being impatient. Here's what happens. You grow your plant, right? You start out with a plant, and you plant it, and then you start to see these little buds, and then you start to see these little green tomatoes, and you're just like, oh my gosh, I'm actually growing. All right, I'm actually growing this fruit or vegetable, or it's a whole thing. People, I know tomato is an actual fruit, but we're just gonna say vegetable. Yeah. You start seeing this, or I'll say fruit, whatever. You start seeing this fruit, and the temptation is like, oh, let me get it now. Especially once you start to see those squirrels come around and they start snatching your stuff. But what's interesting about this particular verse is that when you wait, right, if you start taking stuff off the tree before it's even ripe or before there's a lot of it, you don't really, it's not going to be as free flowing as after it's matured a little bit, because first of all, you have the fruit falling that's going to then probably seep back into the ground and create more trees and more plants. And then it's just like when you have a lot of it together, it's just all working together, and anything that's growing like that, now you have an abundance. Yes. But if you're trying to pick it off as it comes, it's just not going to grow as quickly. Yeah, it's just not. So I thought that was really interesting too.
And an abundance is great for everybody.
Everybody eats.
Everybody eats.
That's interesting.
All right, guys. Leviticus 22 to 23. This is behavior around sacrifices and defining festivals. So this is about the behavior of sacrifices. That's mostly, it just breaks down.
It breaks down how they're going to sacrifice the animals, how they're going to eat, what they're going to eat. They mention that the animals are to be without blemish. I think there's a reason for that too. That's probably what stood out to me the most to answer the question. But animals that are blind or fractured or mutilated or have sore running wound or itch or scabs, you shall not offer them to the Lord or make an offering. So these are more specific sort of things around these sorts of rules, but they're describing a festival where they talk about the Sabbath a lot, and how, it's very specific about how you have the regular Sabbath, but then you have all of these days, and you count to 50 days, and the day after the seventh one. As we were reading it, I was understanding it, but I couldn't have gone back and written it down or explained it to you, because it was so specific and it was so detailed that it was after 50 days you do this, and then you do a grain offering, and then you do this, and then it's offering by fire. The feasts, right? So the feasts were the Passover, the unleavened bread, the harvest, the first fruits. They have all of these feasts, the trumpets feast, the Day of Atonement feast, the Tabernacle. So they list all of these things, what it celebrated and what its importance was, is everything that was broken down in here. I think the thing that stands out to me the most is, well, first, the specificity of I think we're reading Numbers next, which I don't know what that's about, but just to tell you, the specific numbers that God gives them as far as the amount of days and the month of the year and how many times you have to drop a drop of blood, and all of these numbers, I know for sure that they're significant. I don't know what the significance is, but for God to be that specific, it's got to have some purpose, right? So I think the thing that stuck out to me the most was just the way, the specificity, the way that things were to be done a certain way in a certain order. And that really stuck out to me because, first of all, it was a lot to take in, and I wouldn't have been able to remember it. But I don't have to remember it because I have a few Bibles to go back and reference. Yeah. But just that need to be that detailed, it stuck out to me. It definitely hit me. And the whole blemish, the animal without blemish thing too.
What stands out to me was the feast, right? And yeah, I can understand the blemishes because I believe it is without disease, and it talks about like when animals are born, and food offerings, burnt offerings, grain offerings. But the feast really broke it down. It was really on the Sabbath is really highlighted. And then, they have Passover. And it's just cool to see some of these things that's still on the calendar. Like Passover is about to come up. Right? Easter. And then it has these days that you probably see on the calendar are like, oh, whatever. Right? But it's very interesting to me that this is a set of guidelines that are followed by people nowadays. So it's, very interesting to see and read it for myself. That's what stands out. Like, okay, I understand why people are celebrating the Sabbath because what has led up to here. And then by reading it, the more I'm reading the Bible, the more fearful I become of the Lord, which means the more wisdom you gain because you're reading the Bible.
Yeah.
So that's why, and I understand why they celebrate the Sabbath because here, let's be honest, man, Lords, you're done. You're dying. There's no gray area. There's no like, oh, I gotta go to PG County Court. It's like, dang, I don't even have a ram left. Okay, I gotta find a sheep without a blemish. And I have to go in front of everybody to do a guilt offering. And if it's a sin that's punishable, you could die. Or, be accosted. Right? So the feast is very interesting, man, to see how the Lord is celebrated,
And so this brings me to the question for this week, which is, what are some guidelines and disciplines that God has set up for you? It could be in the Bible, it could be things you learned in church, but or it could be some things that maybe God told you specifically to do. What are some guidelines, laws, disciplines, rules that God has set up for you that you feel have protected you, have protected you and your community, your family? I'm really curious to know that. What are some laws and some disciplines that you feel like God has set up for you that have protected you? I know I have some, so we just want to hear from you, though. We want to know what you think.
So we're going to shout out. I'm going to do a shout out. You want to follow Miss Damita Jo. And just for anything, if you want to get like heads up on Black businesses, we watch this show called Ready to Love. Faith and her have a live they do every Thursday at 7. And information is gonna be in the description. I got you guys. Also want to shout out, I'm a Unicorn. That's Faith's planning channel. So if you love pins,
oh my gosh,
and planning and bullet journaling, I'm a Unicorn is the place. And then if you love sports, I have another podcast called Fourth Quarter. That it's on Apple Podcast, and then that link will be below too. We post on IG and Facebook, and it's just, listen, it's from a fan's perspective, man. And sometimes if you're like me, you get tired of listening to the same voices, so it's just something to change it up. So that's some of my shout outs. Hope you did a good job.
Yes, those are the people I would have shouted out. So next week we're reading Leviticus 24, and we're going to finish out Leviticus. So we're going to read Leviticus 24 through 27, and then we're going to read Numbers 1 through 4. So that's Leviticus 24 through Numbers 1 through 4, right? I would have said Leviticus 24 through Numbers 4, but That just sounds weird.
So here's the great thing, guys. We finished Genesis, Job, Exodus.
Now we're about to finish Leviticus.
4.
We're moving right through
Come
this,
on,
and it's
man.
fun.
Come with us,
We
man,
really encourage you to read along with us.
Yeah.
As this is why we're doing this, because we want to encourage a community of people to read the Bible together. It's so much fun reading it together.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I've tried in the past to read it by myself, and I didn't succeed at that. But when I'm reading with James, it's much more fun and interesting, because the things that I'm confused about, he knows, or the things that he's confused about, I can understand, or neither of us understand it, and then we don't feel crazy because we're like, oh, you didn't get that either.
Yeah.
So it's fun to read along with somebody. We always say this is our sort of interpretation of what we feel like it meant, but we always just want you, don't take our word for it. Go to the source. Read your Bible. So we always got to reiterate that. I had a fun week this week, and I look forward to all the reading that we're going to do next week. And we just hope you all just join us for the journey.
All right, guys. Peace.